It wasn't just me. I want to bring this point up too. You know, any business, you need to surround yourself with people that know more than you do.
Hello, and welcome to the show. Our guest here we're sitting down with is David Larsen today. Just a really fascinating story of entrepreneurship. David, if I remember right, you came all the way from Oregon when
That's
you came
right.
up to go to Virginia Tech as an instructor.
That's
One
right.
of the only people to get tenure at Virginia Tech with just a Bachelor in Science degree. And what David's been telling me was actually his roots was that of a farm boy. So he's kind of this hybrid. You got a farm boy who also taught electronics for scientists at Virginia Tech and ended up in Floyd in 1987. And so I think we're going to have a fascinating conversation. He's a really entrepreneurial guy. He didn't just teach at Virginia Tech, but he did a lot in his time here in Floyd. So David, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
David, if you will, tell us a little bit about living here in Floyd, what it's like for you.
Well, I love Floyd. We love the scenery. We love the Blue Ridge Mountains. And it's sort of like I grew up in Oregon, Western Oregon, and they have some small mountains too. So it reminds me of where I grew up and where I was a farm boy. But I like the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's quiet here fundamentally, a lot of privacy, art, all kinds of things, music. It's just a beautiful county.
We happen to agree. We're here. We're private lending's out of Floyd, right in the heart. So we love it here too, and we love that you're here. So you actually came out from Oregon. It was when you got a job with Virginia Tech.
Right, yeah, 1967. Yeah, I'd been working in the electronics industry and chemical instrumentation, and I was hired by Virginia Tech chemistry department to come out in 1967 in a faculty position and teach a course we call electronics for scientists, to teach non-engineers about electronics and how they could use it in measurements and in their research and so forth.
That's fascinating. I love that they went and got a farmer's kid to come and teach all these kids about how to do their electronics. Now, you weren't just teaching though, you were kind of entrepreneurial from a pretty young age. What shaped you early on? What do you feel like, what would you attribute to having that entrepreneurial spark?
Well, part of it was my father. Growing up on a farm, he was business entrepreneurial. He had a small farm, subsistence farm, and people think subsistence farms are new. My dad had a subsistence farm in the 40s when I grew up, in the 50s, and he had a table out in front selling tomatoes and all that. But he also bought and sold a little real estate and a little bit in the stock market. So I was observing that, and that sort of was the start of my entrepreneurial interest, you would say. It was through my dad, actually, who was not educated, had a fifth grade education. He never even went to school, basically.
I love that. I think, one of the core reasons that this show exists, as you know, is that we want to show people that either if you're not in a small town, that you probably are underestimating a small town, and even if you are in a small town, like our small town of Floyd, you're probably still underestimating your small town. And one of the things that I've learned growing up here is that people don't realize how many skills you build if you're in a rural community, especially if you're a farmer or you're a farmer's kid. You have these farmers that are growing up and people are like, oh, they just farm. Well, it's a lot more than that, as you know, right? It's, you have to understand how to essentially run a small business. You have to understand weather and science and chemicals and soil. You have to understand how to grow things, and you have to understand how engines work. You're doing repairs and you're selling things too, because you have to sell your crops. And one of the things I learned early on, as a finance guy, is that a lot of farmers are actually playing the commodities game, because they are essentially having to buy commodities futures. And so people, if you're from a small town, you may not realize how many skill sets you're building with some of the stuff you're doing here that will allow you to be successful in the future. And you kind of are a really good example of that. So you did that. So what did you start doing entrepreneurial when you got into in from Oregon all those years ago?
When I came to Virginia Tech in 1968, like I said, I grew up on a farm. I was a farm boy. I loved dirt, all that sort of thing. So when I started teaching, I thought, well, I'd like to play in the farm a little bit. So after I'd been here a year, I bought a farm. Thought, well, we'll grow some Christmas trees. I knew a little bit about Christmas trees because I'd studied it in high school and college, a little bit about the economics of Christmas trees. So we just started out with an interest in farming, but my main interest, of course, was over teaching electronics for scientists at Virginia Tech. So I thought, well, I could do a few Saturdays a year and, put around with Christmas trees. So that's how we got started in that part of the business.
So you went into something part-time, and it was something that you didn't even have a lot of experience in either. So
None.
you kind of started from the ground floor. How did you build that up?
Well, we went into it as strictly a hobby, and then we got into it, we grew some trees, and we saw that there was a market for trees back then. There's a market now, but there was a real market back, this was like in the early 70s, a long time ago. We saw there was a market, so we grew trees, and then we started selling trees. We actually bought trees wholesale to sell because it takes 8 to 12 years to grow a tree. So those first trees didn't come to market for a while. So we were anxious to actually start selling trees. So we bought wholesale trees, and there was a store called Hills. We started selling trees on a lot there, and it just sort of built up, and it was successful. We were selling the trees, growing the trees, and so it just kept expanding kind of organically. We never really planned to have a very big operation, but it was successful, and one step led to another. We bought one farm, planted trees on it, bought another farm, planted trees on it, and it just kind of kept going until we had a very large Christmas tree operation here in Floyd County, Virginia.
How large is large?
That's a little hard to say in the sense that we were up in the many hundreds of thousands of trees in
Wow.
production.
Wow.
I don't actually know how many, 300,000, 250, a lot of trees.
It gets a little fuzzy after
really,
after 250,000 trees, you lose count.
Yeah.
It's hard to count each one, probably.
Yeah. So we ended up with a number of farms with trees on them, and of course some of the trees, when we actually started marketing trees, some of them went out as landscape stock too, ornamentals, but mostly Christmas trees.
Wow. So you mentioned that it was a step-by-step process, right? And I think for maybe someone who is listening and what are some of those first steps? What were some of the first steps that you made that moved the needle?
Great question. Well, first steps, like I said, we wanted to sell some trees, so we went to start selling a few retail lots. Well, we started with one retail lot, then we went to another retail lot. And by the way, just to digress a little, we didn't only buy farms, we actually leased farms, some of them to grow trees on from the owner. We leased them for 20 years to grow trees on. But as we got more and more trees, we started to actually harvest trees. And then we got to the point where, how can we sell all these trees? We're looking around at one of these farms and they're like acres of trees. And by that time, I'd hired a full-time forester to manage my tree farms for me. And we're looking around, his name was Mike Ziegler, and he worked for me for 27 years, and he's still my neighbor, lives down the street from me. Anyway, we're looking at all these trees one day, and I said, what can we do to sell these trees? Because we can't sell all of them at the local market. There's not that many people around. And we can wholesale them, obviously, and we did that too. But I don't know exactly how the idea came to us, but we said, well, maybe we can figure out how to sell the tree direct to the customer. So if the customer isn't in Roanoke or Blacksburg or Christiansburg, we can sell trees to a guy in New York or a guy in Chicago. Well, we didn't send too many west, mostly north and south. New York was a big market for us. And Florida, we figured if we can send a tree direct to the customer, and how can we do that? Well, at that time, UPS was known for picking up big loads of material product from a company and then distributing it to the wherever it was going. So I called up UPS and see if they would be interested in it and would work with me on the trees. And they said they would. So then we started in the barn just packaging a few trees in a box 6 foot long and selling them. And, you know, we had some success. And we did that for a few years. And then we moved out of that barn into a bigger barn. And then when it really came wide open, the business itself. And this is one thing I would suggest. Don't ask for something if you don't want it. And if you want it, ask for it. But you have to be reasonable, of course. But the one thing we did in 1981, 82, I wanted to, how do you get publicity? So, well, gosh, the Wall Street Journal is a great place for publicity. So I called up the Wall Street Journal, just like I called up UPS, say, would you deliver my trees? Call up the Wall Street Journal, would you do a story on Christmas trees? They said, well, we do one story a year from all the bureaus, and they compete to have a story in the newspaper. So I called several bureaus, and then Pittsburgh Bureau, there was a lady there, said, yeah, I like your idea of Christmas trees. So she wrote a little article. It was published in January. Yeah, no, it was published in December 12th of 1982. And as a result of that, I got a call in January from a buyer from Spiegel Catalog, one of the largest mail order catalogs around, not probably the largest, but the largest. He said, hey, David, we'd like to drop ship your trees. I said, oh, gosh. I said, well, we're just a little operation out here in the mountains. And he said, well, let me come out and see it. He came out and looked around and everything, and we just, you know, working in a little barn, and it was just really a small operation. He said, yep, this is good, we'll do it. So we start shipping trees not only to our own customers, but to their customers, and then other mail order companies came on board. And so that it just led to one thing led to another, and it just kept getting a little bigger and a little bigger, and it really worked. It just sort of organically grew, but we directed the growth. You know, we would go see this, to move it in this direction.
That's awesome. There's a couple lessons that you put in there that I want to call back to, and one is the idea of innovation, right? Is you did something that's common, right? There's so many Christmas tree farms out there. That wasn't the novel idea, but then what you did was you said, how can we do this in a way that people aren't doing it, that makes what we do just a little bit more valuable, or gets us in the hands of people who wouldn't normally be able to buy from us. And I think that's a really important lesson that you learned there, because, you know, I think a lot of people think of innovation, right? And they think of, well, that's something that belongs out in California, in Silicon Valley, right? But that's not true. You can innovate a Christmas tree farm. You can innovate a gas station, right? If you can think about who are your buyers, who are your customers, what are you providing, where do you add value, and you can find and tweak one thing and solve one problem that other people aren't doing. It sounds like that was one of the big first steps, was probably that direct to consumer.
And that grew in this sense, and other people need to think about this. We first just started selling Christmas trees for a year or two. Then we said, well, we have this customer, what else would they buy? Would they buy a wreath? Would they buy a rope, pine roping? And so we started selling and we didn't make these products. Those products we bought from other local growers, wreaths and roping. Local people here that made those, we bought those and started selling those. Then we said, well, we need a tree stand. So I went to a tree stand manufacturer and I said, hey, I want a tree stand, but I want my name on it. So we started selling we called ourselves Brookfield Christmas trees at that time. So we expanded the basic tree business into the customer that would have an interest in other things that related to that. It was a natural market. So that expanded our market a lot too.
Mm. This is probably a question other people are asking whenever people talk about business. How did you fund it, right? How did you, obviously you said you had to buy these trees and plant them, and it takes 8 years, right? How did you fund that business?
Well, that's a really good question, and of course that's an important part of growing Christmas trees. They don't produce anything for 8 to 12 years marketable to speak of. You got to put money into it. I was fortunate at that time going back to the university, to got together with a small group of guys, and we started to do some entrepreneurial things over there, writing educational books and stuff that produced from royalties. So I didn't have a family that had any money to support me. I didn't have any money either at the time, but we had these royalties coming in. So we were able to actually self-fund through another mechanism, and not everybody would have that, but people do have other sources of funds, family members and so forth. But I financed it primarily through book royalties, which was delightful to have at the right time.
So you were writing books as well. So you're teaching, you're writing books, and you're growing Christmas trees.
Yeah.
That sounds like it was probably a busy season of life.
Well, let me tell you, it wasn't just me. I want to bring this point up too. Any business, you need to surround yourself with people that know more than you do about things that you don't know. You know the core of what you're trying to do. And in the book business, I had 3 other people that helped me. One of them was a professor at Virginia Tech, Professor Roney. 2 of them got their PhDs in the department. I was in the Department of Chemistry teaching electronics for scientists. So we came together to create a basic book, and then that was like the Christmas trees. That was successful, so we went to another book, and then we started hiring writers and so forth. So it became a whole technical book publishing company for 12 years. And we published over 70 books in that 12-year period. Now, we didn't write all of those. Even our own group didn't. We hired 31. After the first few years, we started hiring other writers to fill in topics. We ended up with 31 writers and 70 books in our series. And so I was fortunate to have a source of funding outside of my own bank account, which was basically none at the start.
That's such an important lesson, though, right? Because one of the things we want people to know is we want people to know it's possible to build wealth in a small town, and it's possible to do it your own way, but we don't want to sugarcoat it, right? And that was the truth of the matter. It wasn't easy, right? You were literally, essentially having to work a job full-time, write books on the side to fund a third hobby, which then became essentially another full-time job. And it's the idea, it's a couple of things. It speaks to your grit, speaks to your tenacity and your inventiveness. But there's a concept, that I like to talk about, right? Whereas essentially, I think it's about understanding it's almost like poker, right? Or any card game. You get dealt some cards. You don't get to control the cards that you're dealt, but you do get to control how you play them. And it's important to understand your hand and play your cards right. And that's exactly what you did, right? You could have said, wow, I don't think I can do this. My parents don't have any money. I don't have money. I can't fund this idea. But you said, I think there's something here and I want to fund it. How can I do it? And you said, well, I've got this other skill set that I can monetize, and I'd be willing to put in the extra work, monetize this skill set, take it, build this kind of dream a little bit slower. And it sounds like that was kind of a winning combination for you.
It was.
You understood your hand and you played it instead of, sitting there and wishing you had a different hand.
Well, I want to emphasize something else too. People say, how did you do these things? I didn't do them alone. This is a really important thing. We worked with other people that were able to do the things I didn't have time to do or didn't have the skills to do. We call that a mastermind group. That's a Napoleon Hill term. So in the book business, we did that. You say we wrote books. Yes, we did. But I didn't do all that myself. It was a lot of other people involved, and we all benefited each other. And in the tree business, it was the same thing. I hired a forestry guy, graduate of forestry, and other people to run the business, and I hired people to do this and that. So I could continue my teaching at Virginia Tech, and basically I was sort of a consultant to all these businesses, and I hired people to run them and to deal with them.
All right, I think it's a great point, right? It's not just you; it's you surrounding yourself with the right people, with capable people. I think one of the, maybe someone here is listening to this and they say, okay, that's great and all, but how do I do that? I don't. How do I find those people, and how do I surround myself with them? Well, how did you do that? What did you do?
Well, if you start to do something that looks interesting to other people, many of them will come to you. But, you go out and you look for those people too. like when I was needing a forestry guy to run my Christmas tree plantation, I knew Mr. Ziegler. He'd actually started to work for me when he was in high school, before he ever graduated from college. So I went to him and I found him. I knew he was there. And in the book business, I went to my friends that were had the same kind of background and interest, and I said, hey, why don't we do this? And we did. So you need to go out and kind of look for people that have a similar interest, or may develop an interest, or they have some other skill that would help your business. And one of those skills would be, hey, maybe they're your financer. They've got the money to get your business going.
You got to know someone with money, right?
Yeah.
That's essentially our business, right? We're the guy with money in real estate. So, let me ask you this: what risk do you feel like you took with the business, and how did you manage it? Right, a lot of business is about managing risk.
Well, I took a lot of risk because actually in the tree business, money was fairly easy to borrow from banks back in those days, and I actually borrowed a lot of money. You mentioned the tree farms. How did we finance them? Actually, we financed a lot of those farms and the operation by just borrowing money from the bank. It was quite easy then. Now it's quite hard, but we borrowed money. So I had a lot of risk of, if things didn't work out, I was pretty far in debt for quite a while, and I didn't get out of debt really for a long time. No, that's not to say I didn't have good cash flow, didn't have money to work with, but I had this debt floating around out here I was working on.
That makes sense. So, I mean, everyone takes risk in some ways. You were able to do it with leverage, and it paid off. What's a lesson you learned the hard way?
Well, some things don't work. Some ideas, you try them and they just don't work. We've had a number of failures. That's not to say, we've had a lot of successes, but the one thing you have to realize along the way, if you try something and it doesn't work, you back up a little bit and try it a little different way. In other words, suppose you want to market something. I don't know what it might be. We've got fabulous marketers here in Floyd County. There's one group, I don't even remember the name now. He does microphones, very sophisticated microphones. I don't know if you know about this fellow. And I'm sorry, I don't know his name now. And we have music studios in Floyd, people making CDs and so forth. Well, these folks have unique skills, and if it doesn't work, you back up and try something else. And we've all done. In the tree business, we did that too. We tried to market this and that. We tried selling Christmas trees in Roanoke, for instance. But we found out that the transportation of going back and forth was too much. So, hey, forget that. It just kills us to spend several hours driving up there and back. So we had to concentrate our retail business close by. So the thing you learn is not everything works. You kind of back up a little bit, try to refine it, find other things that work, but just refine the basic idea. If the basic idea is not good, you want to, get away from it. But if the basic idea is good, maybe there's other things that make it grow. Because really, when you start a business, there's nothing, there's zero, and you want it to grow.
The best wealth builders almost have a little bit of a scientist in them, right? Where it's, hey, you have a hypothesis, you have a theory, you have to go test it, and not all those theories are going to be right. You have to tweak it. You have to keep trying, and so what was something? So you said selling trees in Roanoke just didn't work with your particular model. Here's another. What would you, if you could go back? What would you do differently with how you used your money and deployed your capital?
Well, that's a question that's hard for me to answer, because the things I've done things that interest me, and they seem to make sense business-wise. It's hard to do a business that you're not really interested in. So number one, you have to figure out what you're interested in. Otherwise, you're going to lose interest once it gets going. You've got to have a kind of a burning desire for something, some kind of business. And I learned that I tried a few things I didn't have that burning desire for, and they didn't work.
What would you say the biggest misconception people have here about building wealth?
Well, the biggest conception they have is you don't do it instantly. You start from zero and you build out. And I think building wealth, um, I don't use that term, but building wealth is okay. Um, it shows compounding interest. In other words, compound interest. I always tell some of my kids and grandkids, look, if you got $10 and you get 10% interest, that's $1. But if you got $100 invested and you get 10%, it's this. But when you get up to $100,000, hey, look, 10% is $10,000. So if you can continue building that wealth, the compounding, it isn't necessarily linear, and it isn't necessarily a rocket ship either. But as you get bigger, you have more to work with, and it tends to multiply a little faster. I think everybody in business has found that to be true.
Right. So for someone who's kind of starting out or just looking at this and trying to learn, right, you would say, hey, it's more important that you start. And once you start, it's important that you keep going. It's not necessarily, you don't have to hit a home run day one. But if you actually go and start, which most people don't, and you just keep going.
Well, I think, yeah, you're right. But I think the important thing is once you start, you want to build a plan, a long-term plan. Now, it may not work out that that plan actually works out the way you plan it, but you plan a long-term plan. Let's suppose you want to sell a gadget and you'd like to sell $1 million worth of them in 10 years. Well, you don't sell $1 million the first year. You plan out, yeah, I want to sell 100,000 first, not dollars, but 10,000, 20. In other words, you have a plan out there you work towards, because if you don't have a plan, you're kind of fumbling in the dark to just hope it works. I mean, you want to be working towards something, and you have to have a plan. Now, the plan may not work. You can back up and adjust the plan. That's a real important thing. But you need to have a plan. What do you want to do? What's your end result? You need to know where you want to end up.
That's well said. Well, we're going to move into what we like to call our Smart Capital Minute. We're going to have some rapid fire questions for folks who, getting some wisdom from David on how to deploy capital. So what would you, of all the things you've done, and you've done a lot more than the Christmas tree, we're focusing on this, but you've been a writer, like you said, you've been a professor, you've sold a lot of real estate, you bought farms. David actually was talking to me about this. He owned 4 of the first Apple I computers, of which you said they only made 200 and not all of them were sold, right? So
that's right.
You have done some fascinating things. We could probably have 10 episodes with David and fill them all up, but we wanted to focus on this Christmas tree farm because we thought is this unique thing that was very Floyd, and it encapsulates a lot of the lessons that you've learned from your broader career. But what would you say was one of the smartest uses of your capital that you've made in your career?
Well, I think real estate investments have probably been the best use of my capital. Really, I mean, and as we've seen, looking back at biblical times, let me say this: in the 40s, land was worth about 10 cents an acre. In the 50s, it was $1 an acre. In the 60s, it was $10 to $100 an acre. So you see where we're going here. It isn't that land just suddenly in the 80s and 90s and here at 2026 started to go up in value. It's always gone up in value because it's a limited resource, and limited resources tend to go up in value more because they become scarce as they're sold off. And that's happening in land, and that's happened since biblical times. So I tell my own kids and grandkids, hey, if you have a piece of land, maybe you can sell it for X bucks. You think that's a lot of money. Well, if you need it, go ahead and sell it. But otherwise, you're better off to keep it. Now, there is a disadvantage owning land. There are taxes, there are expenses, and there may not be any income. So you have to be able to justify all of that. But real estate by far has been the best place I've ever placed any money.
What do you have any money regrets? Is there anywhere you put your money where you're like, that didn't work out like I wanted it to?
Well, I certainly haven't been successful on everything. I put money into various things that weren't necessarily large amounts of money, but they didn't work. And no, we never went very far with it. Then we saw it wasn't working, we backed off. So Not that everything worked great, but some things we just got out of them when they weren't working and went different directions.
Okay, so that's a good lesson, right? Is being knowing when to keep on keeping on, and knowing when to pull out of something and cut your
Yeah,
losses.
exactly.
To someone who's maybe starting out in the area, right? They're maybe in a small town and maybe they have, $25,000 to $100,000. They want to do something with it. They want to make a smart money move. What advice would you have to them?
Well, a couple of advices. Of course, I don't know what they would do with that 25,000. Maybe they want to. Well, we have a nice coffee shop in town, but I've talked to a number of people that are thinking of marketing coffee. Well, regardless of what you're marketing, look, in Floyd, we're fortunate to have fiber. You cannot have a business in Floyd that depends on just retail business, walk-up business. There's not enough population. There's not enough tourists. Yeah, there's busy weekends. You'll make a lot of money, but throughout the 12 months of the year, you're not going to be successful every day of the month. So you need to have a component of your business that's somewhere else, online marketing of some kind. And that's easy to do in Floyd. We have fiber optics. There are a lot of people in Floyd that are already selling things all over the place on various markets. So the one thing about whatever business you start in Floyd, don't think that you're going to be successful necessarily in Floyd. And I think a good example is we've had some restaurants close lately. They just didn't have enough revenue. I don't know why they closed, but my suspicion is they didn't have enough revenue to really justify their business. And we don't have a lot of walk-up business. So any business you start in Floyd, you may have a walk-up component, but you better have an online component too. There's just not a lot of business, not a local business. We're a small county.
That's a great piece of advice, not just if you're in Floyd, but if any small town really, right?
Any small town, for sure.
Any small town with good internet, right, is what David just said. Is you have to realize you have limitations sometimes of small town, especially if you're trying to sell to the consumer in that small town. In this digital world, part of your strategy as you begin to think about your business should be not just trying to capture the market locally, but how can you sell out into other markets? That's a great piece of advice.
Well, I think in addition, how do you do that marketing? I'm not necessarily a marketing expert by any means, but you need to blog about your business. You need to have a video about your business. Post some stuff on YouTube. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. And then some of the social media. The marketing potential there is absolutely mind-boggling, frankly.
Speaking of reputation, last question on this segment is what role do you feel like reputation played in your success? Did that matter?
Well, of course it does. If you cheat people, don't treat them right, you're not going to have much business. So, generally speaking, walk the extra mile, do extra things. Share what you have. There's some sort of rule, universal rule. When you share, you get more back than you share. And that's with customers. I mean, if you have a customer and he has a complaint with a product, satisfy the complaint. Maybe give them a new product. So there's that aspect of go the extra mile, treat your customers right. There's two words that are really important. Please and thank you. Two best words in the vocabulary. Please and thank you for doing whatever you did. And gratitude, which is a combination of all that.
Kind of along the lines when I was in high school, one of our teachers, Coach Turpin, if you know him, if you're from Floyd, he said, there's a lot of good old boys that got grades, that got graduated and got past classes they shouldn't have because they said yes ma'am and no ma'am and yes sir and no sir. And I took that to heart. And I can tell you it does work. I probably did better in some classes than I probably should have in Floyd, just like you said, by the way you treat people. So I think that's well said. As we kind of wrap it up, I've just got a couple maybe introspective questions for you. Now, we've talked, about building wealth. We think building wealth is important, but we don't think wealth is limited just to money. And so, maybe my question to you is what are some things in your life that have mattered to you more than just money itself?
Well, Money really doesn't matter too much. I mean, you need a certain basic amount to exist, but beyond that, quite honestly, family. Now, family may include people that are not directly in your family, but your closest friends. But as we get older, and I'm a little bit of an older guy, money becomes really less important and family becomes more important in many ways, all the way down to the great grandkids and treating them right and having family and then sharing with not only family but other people. But I find family, and family could be not necessarily a blood family, but you may have a family of friends and you treat them right. And so it's that group that you work with and treat them good. I think that's one of the more important things I've learned, and one of the more joys of life right now is that kind of thing.
What would you like to be known for?
Well, I'm not going to be known for too much of anything. When I'm gone, my family will miss me. But here's the thing. I tell my family and other people, you know, I'm 87. At the most, I have 13 years. And when I'm gone, okay, yeah, you're going to be a little sad, especially my wife's going to be very, very sad. But I've had a great life. I've had many failures, but I've had a lot of successes, enjoyed life. My wife and I have traveled the world. We've done things we enjoy and some things we didn't enjoy. But overall, I've had a great life. And so if you, in your business world, which we're talking about here, if you do things you enjoy, as you get older, you're going to say, well, that was a good thing. I enjoyed that. It was a good life.
Well said. Well, as we wrap up, David, what are you up to nowadays, and where can people find you?
Well, we have an office here in Floyd called the LCF Group. We still do buy and sell a little land for sale by owner, and we welcome anybody to drop by our office over on Needmore Street, stop in and say hello. I have some great people work for me. Dee Wallace, my executive assistant, worked with me for 25 years, a wonderful lady. And other people, my wife is involved in the business, and several other people, and just great people. And we have a few rentals and so forth. We do buy and sell a little real estate. It's small compared to, you know, big investors, but we still, even at my age, I come to the office every day. Now, I may only be in the office a little while, but I'm out doing something else with one of the rental properties or something. So come by and see us. We're here in town, going to be here. My wife and I are going to stay here the rest of our life, however long that may be. We love it here.
Well, that's great, and it's always good to have you here at the Private Lending podcast studio and golf simulator. We appreciate you coming, David. It was great
thank
talking
you.
to you.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you.